Molt bé, continuem, doncs. We go on with the new, well, not panel, but keynote speech, maybe. When we were starting to prepare this event today, I had read that France and Paris were a little bit in advance of implementation of sustainable and green finance, and I called some friends in Paris. In particular, I remember a person from a bank and also a person from CFPB, Centre de Formació de la Profession Bancaire, and both people told me the same name, which is Maria Letizia de Robert, which is casualty. I think Paris is quite big, but you know, the answer was exactly the same from both contexts. And then we entered in contact with Maria Letizia de Robert and with Le BIP and BDO. Okay, thank you for being here, you and Renaud Müller, which is also a manager in BDO, for this intervention, to add more information, to add more knowledge on this topic of today, which is the sustainable and green finance. Maria Letizia de Robert is a senior partner at BDO and works for the advisory office, Le BIP. She holds what I would like to hold in my next life, which is a PhD from Sciences Po. I would like to be a Sciences Po alumni, but I'm not. Maybe in the next life, no, I will study there. I think Renaud is also Sciences Po alumni, right? Okay. She has been university lecturer and research during 10 years. She has worked for the French Ministry of Defense, which is not any Ministry of Defense, but is a nuclear one, and it's important. And she's in BIP for 7 years now, working on issues related to strategic foresight, human resources, and non-financial reporting, which is probably the way that you're entering precisely in sustainable and green finance. She has helped large banks answer their strategic questions. Renaud is also manager at BDO, works for the advisory office Le BIP. He graduated from Sciences Po in Paris in economics. Renaud has developed an expertise in integrated reporting and work for different companies and on missions related to the impact on regulation on activity and employment. Okay, we asked them to give their foreign vision of what sustainable and green finance is, and they have as a time, I will say, 25 minutes to have 7 minutes for questions, okay?
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We'd like to thank IF for this invitation. We are pleased to present here in Barcelona the results of our mission. We have been commissioned by the French Banking Association to carry out an impact study of green business on the banking industry, and especially on its human resources. The goal was to prepare the banking industry for tomorrow in a greener world. The French Banking Association has considered, you said, after talking with you, that it will be interesting to share with you the method we have used with the major French banks, BNP Paribas, Société Générale, BPCE, HSBC, La Banque Postale for the main one. We will also, of course, present the key findings of the missions. First of all, I'd like to present briefly our company. We are a consultancy firm specialized in data-driven strategy. We support our clients in the definition and implementation of their strategy. We address all key issues of large company and sectors, for example, long-term strategic review, due diligence, market forecast, impact studies of technological change or regulation on activity, employment, and skills. We have, among other, recently carried out a study, an impact study of digital transformation on the banking sector by 2025. So let's go on. At the beginning of the mission, we met with managers from banks. The conclusion was the concept green business made sense to them, but the impact of the green business on their daily tasks wasn't obvious. Except, naturally, for the pioneers of green business. Step by step, they managed to put green business on the agenda, and they finally get a seat in the executive committee of these banks.
This is quite surprising because on the other side, you see here a press review showing that green business is a trending topic for everyone. And this is the press review from the week before our first presentation in Paris. And so there's a sort of discrepancy between the feelings in the banking sector, or at least of the people we've met in the banking sector, and the current topics that are being addressed by international institutions or by the economy in general. So if we take a historical perspective, and if we go further in time, we've identified three phases. The first one being an initiation phase, where the green transition has been initiated by pioneers. But everything really started in 2009 with the COP15 and the failure of the Copenhagen Agreement. And that's when green business started to become a thing, and we are now in the engagement phase. Of course, as mentioned by the previous speakers, the COP21 in Paris in 2015 played an important role as it included banks and as financial institutions committed to finance the green transition. And then we expect green business to become mature starting 2020. For example, there are some French banks that aim at managing only ISR funds by 2020. So we expect like the phase of maturity in 2 years. So the main issue was to reconcile the points of view of the different people that we've met in banks during the missions, and the importance of climate issues, which is widely known and which explains why we are us today. So this presentation will be divided into two parts. The first one being about the impacts of green business on the banking sector, and I'm going to be quite fast on this one as the previous speakers have already talked about that, and it's going to be some sort of a wrap-up of their conclusion. So you see here what we call the tree of green business, with the different factors driving green business for banks. And among the different factors driving green business, there's of course a world which is changing. There's first societal pressure, where non-governmental organizations and citizens scrutinize the actions of banks, so banks have to take actions if they want to keep their clients. Then there's technological change, of course, which is a major factor of change for banks. There are new climate-related risks that need to be taken into account by banks, and previous speakers have talked about that. And then, of course, there are international commitments by international organizations, and there are, of course, new regulations being strengthened, and that needs to be taken into account by banks. And then, of course, the main factor is the transformation of business models. So we've benchmarked the different sectors of the French economy and of the economy, and what we've seen is that green business impact all functions of companies, and that corporate management is impacted from the beginning to the end, so from supply management with all the questions related to sustainable sourcing, for example, to the production process, of course with the industrial ecology and increase of efficiency and reduction of GHG emissions. Then there's the marketing part, which is affected, as clients' expectations are moving and companies need to take into account this new demand for green products. And then, of course, communication, where there are reputational risks for company and, of course, regulatory requirements linked to non-financial reporting, for example. So what we see is that companies today cannot have a green strategy next to their strategy. They have to include green in their global strategy. So green business is really a factor of change, a main factor of change, and this will affect, of course, banks in the short term. So we've talked about labels during the first part of this conference, of course, and so the increasing expectations of consumers regarding green business, of course, have led to the development of labels. And we believe, and we've talked with banks about that, and we believe that banks could use blockchain to certify green products, for example, and some of them already have started thinking about that, and some of them have already taken actions, as there's this startup called Comgo, which has been funded by some major French banks, and which aims at using blockchain to make a commodity trading easier. So banks are changing as well in a changing world, and with two respects. The first one being a generational effect. So as you know, as time goes by, new people are more and more aware of environmental related issues, and so banks need to include these issues in their strategy if they want to attract new talents. And then, of course, there's a proactivity on the side of banks. And what kind of actions do they take? Well, for French banks, here you see a few examples of sectoral policies that they have taken. So they have decided to withdraw from some sectors, for example, from the sector of energy production with thermal power plants or with oil sands, and they have framed their investments in some sectors, for example, in mining. This has a very important impact for the human resources of banks, and we'll see that in a minute. But banks need to be coherent. We've talked before about credibility. If banks have decided to implement these sector policies, they need to implement them from A to Z in order to be coherent and to be credible when they have to face clients or stakeholders. So all branches of the banks are impacted. This is not only retail banking, but this also concerns insurance, corporate and investment bank, and asset management as well. So green business really impacts the banks from A to Z. But of course, the level of maturity is different depending on the different branches. For example, in France today, we see that asset management is the most mature branch. We see that the share of ISF funds is very, very high compared to other branches. Corporate and investment bank is the second most important, let's say, sector in terms of maturity, as of course there are new client needs, and that this CIB have incorporated these new needs and is now quite advanced. And retail banking and insurance are now lagging behind. But we expect retail banking to be the most mature sector by 2025, as there are many issues for private consumers, for example, regarding energy efficiency of houses. The French government has a very ambitious plan. They expect to increase the energy efficiency of 50% of all buildings by 2050, and of course there's funding needed for that, and so we expect retail banking to take the lead in 10 years or even less than that. So the green transition is full of opportunities for the banking sector. You see above, for example, that ISR funds in France have performed as well or even better than the CAC 40 over the first semester of the year. And if you look at previous results, usually they even overperform the traditional indexes. as you see here, the figure related to green funds and green bonds in France are still quite small if you compare it to the rest of, if you compare it to traditional products, but they are growing. For example, the green bonds issued in France, the amount has been multiplied by almost 4 between 2017 and 2016. So there's a reservoir of opportunities for the banking sector, without a doubt. And of course, in France, the investment needs for the green transition are very big. They're estimated to range between 10 and 50% of total investment. So of course, there are business opportunities for bank. And if we look at the different sectors with the major impact on climate change in France, you see that, for example, in the construction sector, the maturity is very low. So there's a very high potential for banks to finance this green transition. And we expect, the amount needed to finance the transition is going to be multiplied by 2.3 by 2030. So there are business opportunities for banks, and banks need to seize these opportunities. They have already seized some of them as they have introduced new green products. For example, French banks have introduced green savings accounts. They have loans for green mobility, for example, for electric vehicles. Of course, green funds and green bonds are also other products that have been developed by banks in this context. Insurance is still is not a very big topic now, but banks told us that they are thinking about it as it's going to be very important. For example, to insure companies and clients against new climate-related risks, for example. So green business is very important all around the world, and you see here some initiatives taken by some financial institutions around the world. Of course, it's only a few examples. There are many more than that, but there are different types of initiatives taken, and some of them are, for example, giving preferential rates to green products, or having green savings account, or even developing new and innovative methodology to include environmental and social risks in their products. Banking associations are also promoting green business, and for example, the French Banking Association is defending what they call the green supporting factor at a European level, and is very proactive in this. So the aim is to mobilize the financial places all around the world in order for banks to catch, so as I said, the opportunities related to green business. So as we've seen, green business is already a big issue, but what about tomorrow? We heard this morning or before that banks have to adopt green business and that they have to change. For this mission, we have designed two scenarios regarding the evolution of green business. So how did we do that? First, we've interviewed with banks and with experts from our network in order to understand the context in which French banks are proactive, and we've designed a strategic diagnosis of the French banking sector. We've designed an international benchmark and sectoral benchmarks in France. After that, we've designed two scenarios. The first one being go with the flow. So in this scenario, which I'm going to present in details in a few seconds, banks are not very proactive. And then there's another scenario which is changing the world, in which banks take initiatives and have a proactive action to accelerate the green transition. And then within these two scenarios, so in these scenarios, for example, in the scenarios changing the world, we expect the European taxonomy to have a tremendous change and help banks so know what is green and what is not. So it's going to be an accelerator of transition in any case in this scenario. And then, so in these two scenarios, we've taken the list of jobs by the French Banking Association, and for each job, they have a list of skills that is required for each job, and we've asked to employees from the bank and to experts. So is green business going to change this skill for this job? And we've done that for a lot of jobs, a lot of skills. It's a very long and difficult job, but we've managed to do that for all all jobs, and I'm going to present the results of this quotation method in a few seconds. So what we believe is there are two kinds of scenarios for banks by 2025. In the first case, so this is the go with the flow scenario, banks follow the trend and they just answer to clients' demand. And on the other hand, there's the scenario which we call change the world, in which banks are really proactive. They contribute positively to changing the world by, for example, informing clients about the impact of their projects on the environment, and by trying to convince them to adopt projects that have a better impact on the environment. And I'm going to give you a very operational example in a few seconds. So which strategy do banks want to adopt? This is an open question to banks, of course. Of course, we would recommend the second one, and I guess everyone here would recommend the second strategy as well. So another very important point of the mission is the impact of green business on jobs. So in the first scenario, we don't see a lot of changes. So there's this scenario which we called so go with the flow, in which the jobs don't change a lot. So for example, here we imagine that a client would go see his banker or her banker and say, okay, my water boiler just broke, I need a new one, can you help me finance a new one? And then in this scenario, the banker would say, okay, no problem, I'm just going to look at your track record, okay, I can give you the loan, sign here, thank you, goodbye. So this is the go with the flow scenario. In the second scenario, which is so the changing the world scenario, in which banks are proactively leading the green transition. So the same client would go see his or her banker, but here the banker would say, so you're thinking about a traditional water boiler, you know that there are some other alternatives which are greener, which are more expensive, but we have a product with a preferential rate for this kind of products, and I can give you the name of a specialist that can talk to you about that. And this solution may be more expensive at first, but we're going to break even very soon, as it's going to be much less expensive to use on your everyday life. So in this case, we see that bankers have a value added. They really have a proactive role, as they not only finance the project of the clients, but they accompany them in greening their different investment projects. So this is an example for retail, but I think it's a very easy way to understand how banks can be more proactive in the transition. And we've talked about French banks, of course. And what they see is that there's a need for more value added from the side of bankers, and being this green bank could, of course, generate a lot of new business and bring this value added. So the results of this quotation method that I've talked about is that we expect in France that 2/3 of bank staff will be concerned in their job by green growth. What does that mean? It means that 2/3 of bank staff will have skills that will be changed by green business. So what does that mean? We've talked this morning about pedagogy, for example. This means that bankers will need to increase their pedagogy skills if they want to sell the green products to the final clients. For example, if they want to explain why green products are better for the clients. So that's, for example, this need. There are some needs that weren't straightforward at first, but which actually are. I'm going to talk in a few seconds about the recruitment of these new the implication for the recruitment, and this implication for the recruitment of new profiles, of greener profile, of course, will have an impact on the HR of the banks. This is not straightforward. If you go ask the HR what are going to be the impacts of green business on your activity, at first they say I have no idea, but then when you dig a bit and when you put everything together, you see that a lot of people in the banks are concerned about green business, and so that's this result. 2/3 of staff will be concerned. But maybe an even more important result is the fact that 2/3 of people will be concerned in their job, but banks need to involve 100% of their employees in the green transition. This is related to the coherence and the credibility of the strategy of the bank. If banks want to be identified as green actors, and if they don't want to be accused of greenwashing, they have to train everyone in the bank, and they have to sensitize everyone to the green strategy of their green strategy. So, as I said, the training part is very important. At first, there are some specific know-hows that needs to be developed for some employees. It's only a few of them. It's, for example, training on environmental law, for example, of this kind of very specific know-hows. Then, for the 2/3 of employees that I've mentioned, soft skills are really at the core of the transition. I've talked about pedagogy, for example, or anticipation of client needs, and there's a need for training in order for these employees to understand how they can be an actor of green growth. And then there's this training for 100% of employees, where everyone needs to be sensitized to the topic in order for everyone to appropriate the strategy of the bank. We've talked with French banks, and they don't have these trainings in their catalog. It's very hard for them when we've asked them, can you tell us what are your green trainings? They had no idea, as it's not an entry in their catalog. So we believe there's a lot of work to be done on this part, and it's very important for the success of green growth. I'd like to talk very quickly, briefly, about an example from Kenya, as the Kenya Banking Association has developed an e-learning platform aiming at training the employees of the sector to green business. And the aim is to train 30,000 employees, so it's not as big as in France or in Spain, for example, but it's already quite a lot of people. And to date, 80% of the employees of the sector have been trained thanks to this online platform. So Kenya is maybe it's maybe an unexpected example, but it shows that banks and banking associations have a leeway, and they can do something about training if others manage to do so. So green business is an opportunity for human resources in banks. It will not only affect skills, but it will also widen the recruitment pools. First, green business is an attractiveness factor for young graduates, as young graduates now want to work in companies that make sense, in companies that are committed to sustainable goals. And of course, the new risks, for example, will generate a need for new profiles. For people with more generalized profiles, which will be able to better understand the many factors that affect green business. Then, of course, green business can increase the motivation and the loyalty of staff. We've heard that from the different persons involved in green business, and give sense to their job, as they will now feel that they work for a bank that has a very positive, banks of course had a positive role for society, but the employees can increase their motivation by thinking that they work for a committed player of green growth. Green growth can also increase the employability in the banking sector and lead to rethink career path as new career paths emerge for very specific and for specific green expertise. Then there's a need for some experts which are specialized in their field, for example, energy transition or this kind of green topics that banks need to address in order to assess the risks linked to this new technology. But overall, there's a positive effect on employment, which is quite different from what we've heard about digital transition, for example, as green business will generate business. We've seen that it's an obligation for banks and that people are expecting green products. So as opposite to other transitions, green business is a positive transition that we expect will have a positive effect on employment and that will not destroy jobs. And I think that for once it's a good news and it's an interesting point to mention.
As a conclusion, as Renaud has explained us just there. First, green business is now a major factor structuring the economy, and French banks are leaders in the fields. I know that Spanish banks are active too, and step by step, it's going the right direction. For us, it's an opportunity for banks, and you have two choices. You could follow the trend and go with the flow, or you could be a committed player of green growth and actively promote green business in your strategy. It's the first point. Secondly, to our mind, it's relevant for you to put green business at the core of your strategy, not after, but at the core of the strategy. To perform, this strategy has to be coherent. Regarding this topic, the key issue is the global coherence of banks' actions in all fields. Internally, for processes, all processes, for employees and the organization, and externally with clients and stakeholders. The coherence is a very important point. That's why we said 100% of bank staff. We recommend that 100% of bank staff have been involved in the green transition. Third, green business does not create new specific skills, but of course some specialized know-how become more important. Renaud has explained us that in France, 66% of employees in the banking sector will see their skills or the way they use them concerned by green business. This is due to more complexity and to the need for a 360-degree approach of the client needs. Staff training plays a key role. Staff training have to be adapted to catch the opportunity of green business, because it's not easy for a sailor to explain some technical details and not financial details offer. And to involve everyone in this strategic orientation. At the same time, green business does not create jobs. It's not the intent, with the exception of a few sectorial experts. However, green business has a positive effect on employment, as it generates a significant volume of activity. This will help banks go on the right path after 10 years of deep transformation. It's a good news. Last but not least, we advise that French banks, and probably you too, could use green business as a lever of attractiveness for your activity. To do so, you have to increase external communication, widen the recruitment pool. You have to increase employability and to rethink career paths. And with this action, the attractiveness of your bank and the motivation of your staff will should increase. So, with green growth, you have the opportunity to make your employees the key players of a responsive economy. Thank you for your attention. And I have forgotten something. We are a French firm, and we joined recently BDO Global. And I'm happy to join BDO Global, which has offices in Spain, especially in Barcelona. And we are here with our recent colleagues, in particular, especially Jordi Torras, which is a partner outsourcing, and Benjamin Araou, And we have time this afternoon to discuss together how we can help us to transfer this study and to help together to help you in this good opportunity.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Marie-Laetitia. Thank you, Renaud, for your presentation. Very interesting because it's a different point of view, and based on this research you have done on the French banking industry. Let me make just a couple of short questions of clarification, and then we can take one or two questions from the audience if you want. What is your impression about the speed of the process? How fast all this is going to go in a certain way? I'm saying that because I was quite surprised. I think it was 2 or 3 months ago in a meeting of a consultative committee of ESMA. We were dealing precisely with green finance, and in an ESMA document it was set, and as a matter of fact that was the main point, to say, okay, let's get this information, but let's park it. The ESMA document said literally that there was a very slow growth of sustainable and green finance around the continent. And they said that, as I said, to say, okay, that could be important, but for the moment we have more with things with much more priority. Do you agree with that, or how is the speed all these changes you believe is going to take place?
So what we believe is that for now, the speed, it didn't go very fast, but it's going faster. But what we've heard from banks is that they are expecting this European taxonomy a lot, as of course they need to know what is green and what is not. And there are some difficulties also, including climate-related risk in their risk model. So they are researching, they are thinking about that, but it's probably going to go faster than before, thanks to, of course, this European taxonomy, which is, as I said, expected by banks. And there's this growing demand as well. You talked about that earlier. We have the impression that there's a growing demand from private customers and for institutional investors for green products and for sustainable products. So if there's demand, of course, at one point supply will follow and it will go faster. And so as I said, if you look at the figures, they are quite small, but there's a huge stock effect. Green bonds, for example, are quite young if you compare it to traditional bonds. So by the time it reaches a very high level, I think we have to wait a few years before it gets very important in terms of stock. But we believe that starting 2020, green business will be much more important than what it is today.
Okay. ¿Alguna pregunta de la audiencia? ¿Pregunta? No? És magnífic perquè estem fora una mica fora de... Ah, perdó? Ah, sí, és la única pregunta. Tienes un micrófono aquí, de primera fila, por favor. Ara arriba.
Thank you very much for the presentation of your report. I have to say that is the best I've seen of this kind, so congratulations for that. I would like to know, in your study, what would you say that is the biggest stoppers in these organizations to promote the green businesses?
Well, organizations themselves are big stoppers. It depends on the bank. In some cases, as we've said, there's someone from this green or sustainable department in the executive committee, so things are going to change probably faster in these banks, but in some other ones, there are still people that are not convinced by the importance of green business. So there are some internal breaks. So that's the first reason. And I'd say that the second break is probably regulation. As banks don't really know what to put. Well, I mean, they have their own idea, but they're expecting this European taxonomy because they don't want to invest a lot in models that would have to change in a year, because the European Commission would say, okay, you said that this is green, but this is actually not green, and opposite. So we expect we're really waiting for this European taxonomy, and it will probably make things a lot faster when it's published.
Okay. Ara sí, estem una mica retrasats. Acabem agraint una altra vegada a Maria Letícia de Robert i a Renaud Miller per la seva participació. And I hope we can count with your colleagues here in Barcelona if we need it again. Thank you.